which we'll go on and break new ground in just a few minutes, but great to see you all. Glad you could join us this evening. So we were talking about the trajectory of C.S. Lewis's, you might say, spiritual life and development. He starts out as a nominal Christian. For reasons we'll talk about later, he rejects that. And by the time he's a teenager, he's become a very outspoken, aggressive atheist and skeptic. That is a very, very bleak view of life. And so he will transition from that orientation to what we call romantic idealism. He'd like to imagine that life has some meaning and purpose, whether there's a God or not. And of course, that's a dead end as well. And so he fortunately is opened up to the reality of the supernatural, the spiritual realm of reality that transcends just naturalism and materialism. But that comes by way of his involvement briefly in the occult. And so that phase only lasts a couple of years. And then he decides, well, maybe Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion is the key to living a meaningful life. And so he delves into pantheism. Now, you probably know, Hinduism, there's probably 1,000 variations and thousands of so-called gods and whatever. So there's an awful lot that you can claim to believe and still claim to be a Hindu or a Buddhist for that matter, although Buddhism actually Buddha didn't even believe that there was a supernatural reality, a person, a God, but unlike Hinduism. But anyway, he becomes a pantheist. And again, that's totally unsatisfying. And so he will finally come to the conclusion that when you assess the realities of human nature and human history, there is so much good in people and throughout so much of history, but there's also really an overwhelming amount of evil. And so what explains that? Well, there must be two gods. There must be a god of evil, and there must be a good God. And so there's an ancient religion that pretty much typifies that orientation, and it's called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism for many centuries, probably near, about 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism was the more or less official religion of Persia, or later Iran. So he becomes associated with that orientation. But then over time, he begins to realize that, in fact, no, there is a common sense of right and wrong, good and evil, although people oftentimes don't live up to that standard. But there has to be a supreme deity and a creator of all that exists and so on. And so we call that theism. The Bible is theistic. Christianity is theistic, but it's a unique form of theism. And eventually, by the time he's turning 30 years old, Lewis is beginning to realize that sort of against his impulses, he's being drawn to Christianity. But that's only after having gone through all these other phases. And so God obviously is just very much involved in this whole process, leading him to an authentic and genuine faith in the Christian faith, belief in Jesus Christ. Now, as a Christian writing in a post-Christian age, remember Europe and Great Britain and all are several decades ahead of, for instance, the United States along the path of secularism and, leaving Christianity behind. And so he's writing in a post-Christian age there in Great Britain, United Kingdom, and Europe in general. And he offers an absolutely scathing critique of the dominant philosophy of the last 150 years, which is secular humanism or humanistic modernism, whatever term you want to use. And like his colleague and good friend J.R.R. Tolkien, Lewis's writings are very self-consciously, very deliberately at variance with 20th century trends and fads. He realizes that the Christian influences that have made Western civilization the greatest civilization in all of world history, those Christian influences are very, very quickly eroding. And that begins, frankly, just not long after the Protestant Reformation and then the dawn of the Enlightenment and so on. And he's very, very conscious of that. And so he realizes that we no longer live in even a nominal Christian culture and society and so on. And so there are so many trends, intellectual trends, academic trends, certainly sexual trends, moral trends. And he realizes that to live for Christ means we're going to have to be consciously and intentionally countercultural. And so that's part of his great appeal is he's absolutely counter to the evolving trends in Western civilization. Now, he'll call himself a mere Christian or a great tradition Christian. And he believes that he has a message to deliver that you might say is trans-denominational. So he doesn't get into a lot of the secondary issues related to the Christian faith and all. He focuses on the essentials, the clear teachings of Scripture that all Christians should adhere to. Now, when you get into denominationalism, everything from, you might say, Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy on one extreme, and the other extreme would be beginning with the Reformation era, it would be the Anabaptist movement and so on. So there's a vast difference, but true Christians, regardless of which extreme and all those other options in between, true Christians believe essentially the same thing because these are truths, doctrinal truths, they're very clear in Scripture. Now, when it comes to secondary issues, obviously, there's quite a vast difference between, let's say, Roman Catholicism and, let's say, the Baptists, for instance. But those are secondary issues. Now, that's not to say that secondary issues are unimportant, but we just need to keep it in mind that they are secondary. They're not the primary issues. All right, so any thoughts, any questions or comments on any of that before we go on and break some new ground this evening? And by the way, I've been asked by those who join us online, any comments or questions you have, if you will, speak as loudly as possible, okay? So they can pick it up. And I may need to kind of repeat or summarize what you've said as well for their benefit. So anything? All right, well, if you're following along in the study guide, what page are we anyway? Okay, we're page 4. Okay, moving right along. Now, a lot of what we're going to be talking about the next several weeks comes out of his somewhat autobiography. It's called Surprised by Joy. The Shape of My Early Life by C.S. Lewis. And if you've never read this, I mean, it is really enthralling. It's absolutely one of the best biographies or autobiographies I know I've ever read. And I think you would find it very, very helpful. He wrote that when he was about 50 years old. And so just looking back at the first 30 or so years of his life up to the time of his conversion, Christian conversion. So it pretty much ends at that point. All right, now, speaking of surprised by joy, Lewis opens his autobiography with these words, quote, "I was born in the winter of 1898 in Belfast, the son of a solicitor." No, what's a solicitor? That's kind of a that's sort of the lower level of the legal profession. Okay, not a barrister who's near the top. So I was born in the winter of 1898 in Belfast, the son of a solicitor and a clergyman's daughter. In fact, his mother, her father and grandfather had been members of the Church of Ireland. Church of Ireland is basically a part of the Anglican Communion. And so his family was part of the Northern Ireland Protestant establishment. These are people who had been given the opportunity to, as you know, back centuries ago, the source of income and wealth or poverty for the vast majority of people was land ownership. And so beginning with King Henry VIII, and that would have been the 16th century, and then following over the next century, certain kings would grant a lot of land to favored people from Scotland or from England who would move to Northern Ireland. And of course, that caused an awful lot of conflict and agitation among the Irish themselves. But anyway, his heritage goes back to Scotland, and the fact that under King James I, the one who commissioned, the King James Bible in the early 1600s, his family was given an enormous amount of, his ancestors were given an enormous amount of property in Northern Ireland and so on. And again, what that does is inflame a lot of ethnic and religious conflicts between the Catholics of Ireland and these Protestants coming in from England and Scotland. Now, these Protestants from England and Scotland were either Anglicans or they were Presbyterians. But either way, there was considerable conflict between them and the Catholic Irish. So anyway, that's his heritage. Now, his father is named Albert. And Albert is a college graduate. He's the first college graduate in his family's history. He's also a police solicitor in Belfast. And in terms of social status, Lewis's family were pretty high up on the social status ladder. His father, as I said, was a solicitor. Now that's the lowest rung on the legal profession, but nonetheless, it's, middle class at least. Albert Lewis, his father, is also oftentimes described as an eccentric. The man was very intelligent, highly imaginative, very bombastic, especially when it got on the issue, politics and issues like that. He could go on and on and on. He really wished he was running the country. And also he can be quite eloquent at times. But he's a member of various Belfast literary societies, and he's a very accomplished public speaker, has a very impressive, resonant voice, has a gift for presenting very complex issues and arguments in very convincing, simple terms. And this is a gift that his son, C.S. Lewis, will certainly inherit as well, as later in life he's explaining the realities, the truth of the Christian faith, and doing it in a very compelling and a very understandable, sensible manner. One of Lewis's biographers, George Sayers, says that Albert Lewis, the father, dabbled at writing mildly romantic and whimsically humorous poetry. He was a talented novelist and so on. Now, in terms of his father's character, Albert was described as very sensitive, very sentimental, very passionate in his nature. The man apparently was scrupulously honest. And in court, though, as a solicitor, he had a reputation as a very fierce cross-examiner. And so again, a very, very sharp mind, very keen mind. Again, one of Lewis's biographers puts it this way: Albert Lewis was a kind man, generous to the poor and the unfortunate, both in gifts and money, and in his legal work, which he would often undertake without payment. So here's somebody who apparently cared about people. And again, in that respect, when you look at the life of C.S. Lewis, you realize that he inherited a lot of his father's talents and a lot of his father's character traits as well. Now, his father, though, was very absorbed in politics, and he was very much a critic of most every prime minister of the day, and none of them really measured up to his standards, okay, for political leadership. He also has an interesting, if rather eccentric, sense of humor. And here's a famous story that Albert Lewis would tell his sons. He says, on one occasion, Albert was traveling on an old-fashioned train with no corridor, okay, no central corridor. The passengers were confined to their compartments for as long as the train was moving. And he found himself sharing a compartment with a very respectable-looking farmer who was dressed in a tweed suit. Well, at one point, the man obviously had to go to the bathroom, but the train rattled on. You couldn't stop. There was no place to go. I guess there were no restroom facilities on the train. So the man's finally pulled down his trousers. Now, by the way, they're probably sitting almost knee to knee, in this very cramped, kind of like we are in this room. So imagine don't imagine that something like this were to happen. But anyway, you get the idea. Okay. So the man pulls down his trousers, squats on the floor, and relieves himself right there in front of Albert. Then he nonchalantly pulls up his pants and sits back down. The odor was nauseating. So Albert took a pipe from his pocket and he began to light it. At that point, the stranger, who had not spoken a single word on the entire journey so far, leaned forward, wagged his finger, shook his head, and tapped a sign on the window which said, "No smoking." There was no sign that said "no defecating." That's a real legalist, isn't it? So anyway, that's the kind of humor that Albert sometimes would transmit. And Lewis learns an awful lot from this man in his early years. Now, despite inheriting a lot of his father's traits, neither Lewis nor his brother's name was Warren, better known as Warney, they never really developed a close relationship with their father. As Lewis later described his father in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Albert was emotionally fragile. Well, yeah, probably that incident on the train would be my guess. But anyway, Albert was emotionally fragile and had a very explosive temper. On one occasion, Lewis and his brother Warney decided to verify the old Irish legend that a pot of gold is buried at the end of every rainbow. So while out walking one day in a rainstorm, the boys began to imagine that a rainbow ended in the front garden of their house. And so they began digging in the middle of a path from the gate out front to the front door before stopping for dinner. Then darkness descended. Albert Lewis arrived home from work, whereupon he promptly fell into the hole, scattering his legal papers, ruining his best suit of clothes. He was absolutely enraged, and he accused his sons of deliberately constructing a booby trap and injuring him while he was out trying to earn a living to support them. Okay. And when little Jack, C.S. Lewis, Jack, tried to explain that they were merely searching for a pot of gold, his father accused him of being a liar. And so Lewis himself is a very sensitive little boy. And when we talk more about, the trajectory of his life, how difficult his life was and all, I think it's easy to imagine why he felt very disconnected from his father, even though his father in general seems to have been a very, very good man. Now, as far as Lewis's mother is concerned, her name is Flora. And oh, by the way, did everybody get a study guide that wanted one? Okay, so you can follow along. Okay. His mother, Flora, was the daughter of a second-generation Presbyterian clergyman. Her Scottish ancestors had settled in Northern Ireland during the reign of, as I said earlier, King James I. Now, her father, a man named Reverend Thomas Hamilton, was pretty high up in the Presbyterian hierarchy. He was the vicar of St. Mark's Anglican Church, a very highly emotional man, we're told. And in fact, Lewis and his brother Warney were oftentimes embarrassed to see their grandfather break down in tears during his sermons. Other than his emotional sermons, though, he was best known for his hostility toward Catholicism. So he believed Catholicism was the devil's, perversion of true Christianity. And as a militant Protestant, he believed that Catholics were, quote, the devil's children. Okay. So that's the pastor under which the young boy, C.S. Lewis, is growing up. Now, his grandmother, Mary Warren Hamilton, was a very intelligent woman from a distinguished family who was passionately involved in liberal politics and the suffragette movement. And of course, when we're talking about liberal politics back then, it has absolutely no relationship to what liberalism is today. Liberalism today is basically socialism. Oftentimes very Marxist-oriented socialism. But back then, the liberals were, they preferred to call themselves progressives, and they believed, and rightly so, that there were a lot of injustices in society and culture that needed to be addressed. And one of those was denying women full civil rights, including the right to vote. So that's the suffragette movement. And that's what Lewis's grandmother was very much involved in. By the way, in college, she was a college graduate, extremely rare for a woman back in those days. And in college, though, she studied logic, part of philosophy, an elementary aspect of philosophy is logic and rhetoric. And she also studied mathematics. She was a very avid reader. And in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis describes her as, quote, cheerful and tranquil and of a cooler temperament than his father was. Now, most of Lewis's biographers have concluded that, in fact, Flora was by temperament rather cold, very detached, and very, very sharp-tongued as well. And although an avid reader, she didn't read nursery rhymes. His mother didn't read nursery rhymes or fairy tales or bedtime stories or anything like that to their children. She thought that was too demeaning. And so she, from the time they were 2 or 3 years old, she's trying to elevate their literary, standards and everything else. But a general assessment is that Flora, his mother, was emotionally distant from both her children and her husband. And so Lewis really grows up without a lot of warm, soft mother love. Okay. And again, we all have very unique backgrounds when it comes to that sort of thing. But imagine growing up and your parents are extremely dogmatic and judgmental, and you never really measure up to their standards and whatever. And so that's the kind of home life he has early in his life. And yet it's ironic that throughout his early adult life, Lewis was very critical of his father, but he tended to romanticize his mother because his mother dies when he's pretty young. Okay. So any questions, thoughts on any of that before we move on to his early childhood? Yes, Bruce?
Just at least some of his father's characteristics.
Some of his father's
William Kirkpatrick
characteristics.
later said to work with and live with and study under.
Yeah.
And was a very tremendous influence on Lewis as well. Kirkpatrick was. You don't know who.
Yeah,
you'll meet him. And
yeah, we'll meet him next week, actually. He's going to show up next week. Yeah. So I guess the bottom line would be, here's a child who grows up in a very, very no nonsense family. Okay. And they're not in any way catering to their children. Maybe, well, apparently in excess, they're not. Okay. So that's the home life. All right, well, let's move on here to his early childhood. And I think I have that subtitle, Jaxie, because when he was 4 years old, he informed his mother and father he didn't like his name. His name is Clive Stapleton, Staples Lewis. And he didn't like the name Clive, and I can't imagine why he didn't like the name Staples. So he tells his parents when he's 4 years old, from now on, you need to call me Jaxie. Okay. And that's the name that he retained throughout the rest of his life, Jack Lewis. Okay. He's born in 1898 in Belfast. His brother Warnie is 3 years older. The Lewis family lives in a very comfortable bourgeois house and live a very bourgeois life. They have now, by the way, this is the middle class. This is not the upper class. They have a cook. They have a housemaid. They have a gardener. They have a governess. And this is a middle class family. Yeah, really. Wow. Now, Belfast was a city with a very large working class. Now, this working class was predominantly Roman Catholic. See, the middle class and the upper classes, they were the Protestants. The Catholics were the lower class, lower income. And of course, there was a lot of tension between the Catholics and the Protestants, as I mentioned. Most of Belfast Protestants, including Lewis's father, Albert, were staunch unionists. In other words, they wanted more of a legal connection with Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, whereas the Catholics were nationalists. They wanted home rule, and like the rest of Ireland. As you know, probably 2/3 or more of the island is Ireland, mainstream Ireland. It's Catholic. And then you've got this, I don't know, 25-30% of the northeastern part of the island that is Northern Ireland, and that's Protestant. Okay. One biographer says, when the young Lewis was being toilet trained, his Protestant nanny, this is a Protestant nanny, used to call his stools wee popes, little popes. And I think that in our entire course going forward, I think that's the last time we'll mention things like that, okay?
Twice tonight.
All that, yeah, twice, yeah. But that's insightful. That was the culture of the time and the culture in which he grows up as a young child. One day when he's 4 years old, he announces that he wants to be called Jaxie. And again, he'll go by that name, Jack, the rest of his life. Now, in 1905, so he'll be about 6 or 7 at this point, the Lewis family moves into, quote, a lumpy Edwardian villa in the suburbs of Belfast, dubbed or called Little Lee. And you can go to Belfast today, and actually that that house is privately owned, so you can't really stop and go in or anything like that. But it's still there. It was a large 3-story brick house with a very large bay window and a very large front porch. The house with its numerous nooks and crannies and creaks and groans and its furnishings influenced his intellectual and imaginative growth and development. So this was not a, little rectangular box. This is as so many middle class and upper middle class houses were back in those days. I mean, it's just very ingenious, the architecture and everything. And this inspires somebody like C.S. Lewis, who has a very, very imaginative nature. He's just fascinated, all the little crooks and turns and, side rooms and things like that. Years later, Lewis will reminisce, quote, "I'm the product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles." Well, again, this is a pretty exceptional young little child, and all of this that he's experiencing, the visual experiences of living in that home, but also all the sounds, unique sounds and whatever, just really inspire a tremendous amount of imagination on his part. And we'll see more about that later here. Lewis grew up surrounded by books, and he developed a very rich, vivid imagination. This is how he puts it in Surprised by Joy. Quote, "My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them." Did you hear that? He bought a lot of books, and come over to our house sometime, and Dolly will give you some books. Okay. So anyway, my father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. There were books in the study, books in the dining room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in the bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the attic, books of all kinds, and absolutely nothing was forbidden me. And of course, back then, I mean, you didn't necessarily have to worry about your little children reading something that would be, immoral and so on. So he had the run of the house and the run of the books, and anything and everything. And he really maximizes the opportunity. On rainy days, he'd pull volumes off the shelves, enter into the worlds of Arthur Conan Doyle, the progenitor of the Sherlock Holmes, series and so on, Mark Twain, poets like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and so on. The family also owned a Victrola with a large brass horn. I mean, those old Victrolas, they were a work of art themselves, weren't they? I'm sure you've seen them. Record players, basically. And so growing up, little Jack and his brother Warnie became very avid record collectors. A staircase in the back of the house led up to a second floor landing. And at the end of the corridor, Jack and Warnie spent countless hours playing in what they called the little end room, their refuge from the grown-ups. And by the way, what would you expect to find in that upstairs little end room? The wardrobe, okay, the wardrobe that he writes about, decades later. Here in what this little boy calls his study, he's 5 or 6 years old and he has a study. His imagination and his intellect just absolutely thrived. He's inspired by Beatrix Potter's books. He writes and illustrates his first stories, fairy tale novels featuring medieval era animals. And so the way he puts it in his autobiography is this, quote, this was an attempt to combine my two chief literary pleasures, quote, dressed animals and, quote, knights in armor. I wrote about chivalrous mice and rabbits. Sounds like the Crusader Rabbit cartoon, the Walt Disney cartoon series. Those of you who were in your hundreds, first decade of your hundreds, you probably remember Crusader Rabbit. I remember I grew up in Southern California, so that was on all the time. And this sounds like the sort of thing that really Lewis was into. Animals dressed up like knights, you know, and fighting virtuous battles and that sort of thing. Oh, and by the way, in his stories about these dressed animals, their main adversary were giants, but also cats. Okay, so this led me, he says, from romancing to historiography. I set about writing a full history of Animal Land. And again, you think, sounds a bit like Chronicles of Narnia, doesn't it? Or Tolkien's, Lord of the Rings, whatever. From history, he says it was only a step to geography. There was soon a map of Animal Land, a precursor to Narnia. Okay, so here he is, 6, 7, 8 years old, and just has quite the imagination. Of course, as we'll notice a little bit later here, apparently he has no friends his age. He's being homeschooled, as we'd call it, homeschooled. And so it's just a little world of his own. And I said I grew up in Southern California. Actually, my first 5 years, I lived in Springfield, Missouri. And we lived in a big 2-story house, probably built around 1900. And I had a little room up there, and that was kind of my study and refuge as well. And I had a little plastic record player. I'd play my records, like Irene Goodnight, if you've ever heard that song, Wooden Soldiers on Parade, things like that. And it was just such a wonderful little world. And then my parents sent me to school, sent me to kindergarten. And it was quite an interruption in my life and my lifestyle, honestly. And after a couple of weeks, I'm sure I didn't use this word, but basically I told my mother that all these kids were annoying, or at least I used, so I would have much preferred to retreat back to my little room there. And I had, like 1,000 little soldiers and everything, and I'd set up, and play with them and all. And when I was 9, I started writing histories and illustrating histories of the American Civil War. And so some of this, until my older brother came along one day, what are you doing? And I said, well, this is my latest story on the Civil War. And I showed him the story and the pictures, and he looked at it and said, that's really stupid. And so I don't think I've recovered yet. But anyway, that's kind of the type of life, he was experiencing. And just really his imagination was going wild. He was so curious and whatever. Now, I think in your notes, the next subtopic there is an intimation of joy. And you notice that his autobiography, he entitles Surprised by Joy. Okay. Now, by the way, this really had no direct relationship to a woman who he married late in life named Joy. But this was a theme that he had developed long before he ever met that woman. Okay. So although Lewis described his parents as being very bookish and very clever, neither was particularly imaginative or aesthetic. They weren't into the arts. And he describes his home as being devoid of artistic beauty. He writes, "If I'm a romantic, my parents bear absolutely no responsibility for that. Neither had ever listened for the horns of Elfland." So in other words, I mean, they were just very practical, down to earth, people. And fantasy and the world of imagination, that's silly, they didn't have time for that. Likewise, despite his grandfather's influence, Lewis had a very tepid Christian upbringing. Neither of his parents were much more than just nominal Presbyterians. They didn't take their faith seriously, really. It was just a cultural tradition. He writes, "If aesthetic experiences were rare, religious experiences did not occur at all. I was taught the usual things and made to say my prayers, and in due time taken to church. I naturally accepted what I was told, but I cannot remember feeling much interest in it. My childhood was not in the least otherworldly. However, one event in particular stirs a sense of mystical wonderment, and this is one of the transformative events in his early life. And it's just so beautiful to imagine this. One day," he writes, "my brother, Warnie, brought the lid of a biscuit tin. I don't know, I guess maybe that size or something like that, a biscuit tin, the lid, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever noticed. It made me aware of nature. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden." So again, if you can just imagine this, and here's a very curious, very, imaginative little child, and his brother brings him this tin, and all of a sudden he imagines, wow, I wish the real world were like that. It's so beautiful. Lewis was absolutely mesmerized by the simple beauty that Warnie had created. Something about the magical garden stirred his romantic sensibilities and called him to a world beyond this one. And that is, that's how the world should be, just fraught with incredible natural beauty. He goes on to write, "It was something quite different from ordinary life, something, as they would say now, in another dimension, kind of an Edenic kind of experience." Now, of course, he's growing up in a landscape that's incredibly beautiful, Northern Ireland. Very lush, very wet, very dewy, this emerald green landscape. And he came to imagine that heaven, if there was a heaven, would be like that. And in one of his most famous books that he writes called The Great Divorce, he imagines just that heaven is just beatific in that regard. Throughout his adult life, he returns to Ireland nearly every year for his annual vacation. So even though he lives from the time he's about, I think, 13 or so, for the rest of his life, he lives in England. And England's beautiful too, but in his mind, it can't compare to Ireland, Northern Ireland. Now, sometime after that, he experiences a similar sensation when he's reading the Beatrix Potter book, Squirrel Nutkin. This sensation of romanticized bliss is what he'll later come to refer to as joy, with a capital J. In other words, it just heightens his sensitivities, sensibilities, and his sense of aesthetic appreciation and so on. And he calls that joy. Joy was more than just happiness. It was more than just imaginative pleasure. It was an incredible and indescribable and transcendent longing, an, quote, unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. So here he's telling us that as a little child, of course, he could never have articulated this at the time, but he's grown up with a sense of transcendence, that this world is not all there is, or at least he'd like to imagine that this world is not all there is. And of course, the older he gets, the more he realizes how this world and this life can never be totally satisfying. And so why do we have an innate sense of that there's something above and beyond, this, our life in this world? And if that's true, shouldn't that be our primary goal in life, is to find out, is there an afterlife? And if so, that should supersede all other, you know, goals and agendas and so on. Pardon me? Oh, yes.
I just heard something the other day that he wrote a book that romantic love is not the best kind of love, that it's a longing that is never satisfied, because romantic love, when you get to where you are, you're dissatisfied, you look somewhere.
Yeah, romantic love.
Love for God is waiting, abiding for him. So.
Right, right. But romantic love can be an intimation of an even greater reality.
Yeah. What do you mean romanticize, not necessarily, like desiring an object, a physical object, instead of, like you said, a longing that doesn't go away. Yeah, good point. Polly, is there a glass back there, bottle, water? Thank you. Would you mind passing it forward? Okay, thank you. All right, now some of you have probably read quite a bit of C.S. Lewis, not only a lot of his books, but even a lot of his essays and articles that he's written. And one of the great books that includes so many of his popular essays is called The Weight of Glory. And in that book, The Weight of Glory, is also an article called The Weight of Glory. He wrote that in 1941. In other words, that's pretty much in the middle of World War II as far as Great Britain is concerned. And in that essay, Lewis refers to his longing for joy, for something that's transcendent to just this life, as a desire which no natural happiness will ever satisfy. He puts it this way: it's difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Again, he's referring to his brother Warney's little, garden that he had put together. It's difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. John Milton's concept of enormous bliss, of Eden, comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire. But what is it a desire for? And he'll realize eventually in his life that even the greatest beauty only hints at a greater reality. But at this point, he's just totally absorbed and caught up in beauty, the natural beauty of the earth and so on. Says, before I knew what I desired, the desire itself, though, was gone. Life goes on day by day, and the world turned commonplace again. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, all else that had ever happened to me seemed insignificant by comparison. So for, I don't know, a few minutes perhaps, he's mesmerized by this little toy garden that his brothers created. But then it's kind of like, okay, back to reality and back to, the demands of life and so on. And so that's what he has to settle for. Now, this was the first mystical experience and the first intuition that this world is merely the shadowlands. Now, that's a term that Plato would have used. This world is the shadowlands, a dim imitation of true reality. Okay. We have a lot to look forward to, don't we? Yeah, absolutely. For years thereafter, Lewis would try to manufacture, quote, joy by one means or another, either by reading inspiring literature or through sex or some other form of pleasure, but none of it ever sufficed. These were all unfilling substitutes. They never satisfy, do they? Lewis puts it this way: I sometimes wonder whether all pleasures are not just substitutes for joy. Okay. And it's joy that we should be pursuing wholeheartedly. That should be our obvious priority in this life. And this was, in effect, Lewis's description of something that Augustine had written about 1,500 years earlier, St. Augustine, in which Augustine wrote, quote, "We will never find rest until we rest in God." This world can be so pressurized and, tense and everything, and it's a struggle, no doubt. And Augustine's absolutely correct, and Lewis is going to come eventually to the realization that we'll never find ultimate rest till we rest in God. And Lewis writes in The Problem of Pain, one of his books, quote, "All the things that have ever deeply possessed your soul have only been hints of joy. Anything that just really turns you on is just a hint of ultimate joy. Tantalizing glimpses of joy. Once experienced, one would say, quote, 'Here at last is the thing I was made for. We cannot tell each other about it. It is the secret signature of each soul. If we lose this, we lose everything.'" Right? So when you get just totally wrapped up in this, living in this material world and making money and acquiring stuff and status and, all that kind of thing, obviously it never satisfies, because that's not what we were made for in the first place. Now, after only about a month after the family moved into Little Lee, the house there, the big bungalow house, his brother Warnie was sent off to boarding school in England. And Lewis's biographer, George Sayer, puts it this way. He says, quote, "This was as bad a school as could ever have existed in England during any period, and it undoubtedly affected Warnie's mental and emotional development. And by the way, it probably, at least Lewis thought, it was probably a contributing factor to Warnie's later alcoholism. His brother suffered from terrible alcoholism most of his adult life. And Lewis thought that it probably started with this horrible school, boarding school, that he was sent off to. I'm sure it was a school that probably had the reputation of being very elite and so on, but it certainly wasn't what he needed for his psychological development or spiritual development or anything. But anyway, with his brother and his best friend gone, Jaxie becomes increasingly reclusive. Now he doesn't even have his older brother, to socialize with. He spent most of his time in solitude, immersed in books and imaginary worlds. Most mornings, his mother would tutor him in Latin and math, and occasionally they would go on walks together in the afternoon, but for the most part, he lived almost entirely in my imagination, had very little interaction with anybody, apparently. Even at church, apparently church just didn't, interest him at all. By the time he was 8 years old, though, he was reading voraciously. For instance, here's a diary entry in 1908. So he would have been only 9 years old at the time. And he writes in his diary, "I read Paradise Lost." Today people read, well, they don't actually read Paradise Lost, but if they did, it would be in graduate school, wouldn't it? So here's a 9-year-old reading that. Okay. By the age of 9, he had developed a daily habit of writing and illustrating books. What was missing was the kind of normal human relationships with peers that children really need to develop normally, holistically. One of his biographers says, quote, "Everything we know about Lewis at this time suggests a very lonely, introverted boy with hardly any friends who found pleasure and fulfillment in the solitary reading of books." I mean, at least his parents could have gotten him in a book club so he could, at least share what he was reading and all. For 2 years, the solitary Lewis roamed the large houses, long creaking corridors and roomy attics with vast quantities of books as his companion. And then we come here to a real turning point in his young life. And I think I've subtitled this in your notes there, A Very Great Loss. His mother, Flora, became deathly ill from abdominal cancer. Lewis was only 9 years old at the time. Lewis writes in his autobiography, quote, "The house became full of strange smells and midnight noises and sinister whispered conversations." For the first time, he's hearing his parents carry on these very private whispered conversations related obviously to her health, but he's wondering, well, what's going on here? This is not normal. His father, Albert, recorded Flora's death and her last words in her diary. So check this out. This is his mother's last words. Just prior to her passing, Lewis's father sought to comfort her by reminding her that God is good. To which she retorts, get this, "What have we ever done for him?" Why should God be good to me? We haven't paid him any attention. Imagine this being your final thoughts. Yeah. Well, Lewis had been praying desperately for his mother to be healed. And as he tells us in his autobiography decades later, the thing just didn't work. For the first time, he begins to question his faith in God. He'd prayed long and hard for his mother to recover, but to no avail. I mean, I thought there was supposed to be a God, and I thought he was supposed to be good, a good God. So, why is my mother in agony? And why did she die, especially when she has young children? So this profoundly affects his emotional life. This very safe and secure world that he was living in came crashing down all around him. Lewis writes it this way. He says, "Everything that had made our house a home was now gone. With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, everything disappeared from my life. All security seemed to be taken from me. There was no solid ground beneath my feet anymore." He says it was all sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. In other words, his stable home life, that was his continent on which he was living. That had sunk, and now everything is just ocean and sprinkled islands. So as a result, he becomes all the more withdrawn. And as he later confided to a lifelong friend, we hold our mental health by a thread. Wow, think about that. I mean, all the trauma and drama, all the opposition, all the heartbreak and agony in this life. And he's absolutely correct. We hold our mental health by a thread, and really only by the providential, grace of God. And by the way, every time I've read that in his autobiography, we hold our mental health by a thread. It reminds me of why we want to avoid mind-altering substances. Okay. Takes us out of the realm of reality, and it takes us into an artificial world, and frankly, a total dead end. For most of the rest of his life, the feelings of abandonment he experienced dominated his relationships, especially with women. Undoubtedly, this was a key factor in the fact that for over 30 years, his primary companion in life was a woman old enough to be his mother. And we'll talk about that, next week or so. When he finally married in his late 50s, in fact, the woman he married was a person whose circumstances exactly paralleled that of his own mother, a woman who was dying of cancer with 2 young sons, just like his mother had. So this was also very, very traumatic on his father, Albert. And Albert was just absolutely emotionally shattered. He was depressed. He was incapable of providing any kind of emotional support for his sons. His depression and his fits of rage ruined his relationship with both of his sons, Warnie and Jack. And Lewis writes, under the pressure of anxiety, my father's temper became incalculable. He spoke wildly and acted unjustly. Thus, by a particular cruelty of fate, during those months, the unfortunate man was losing not only his wife, but both of his sons as well. They didn't like him anymore, and they just wanted to detach. I mean, he'd become, in their minds, a tyrant. So for most of the next 20 years until his father's death in 1929, Lewis distanced himself from his father. Unlike his father, who was very passionate and emotional, Lewis became very cool and very detached. His persona was quite the opposite of his father. And unlike his father, who was obsessed with the machinations of politics, Lewis was generally indifferent, at least until he became a serious Christian. And then he began to realize how important politics is. And a lot of people who have read a lot of Lewis's writings are not really aware of that. But he wrote extensively on politics. And so I wrote a book 3 or 4 years ago called C.S. Lewis on Politics, Government, and the Good Society. And again, this is a theme that even a lot of C.S. Lewis scholars have just totally, been oblivious to and overlooked. But his wisdom when it came to politics is, I think, very, very, very admirable. And we would all do well to take his advice today, given our political situation. All right, now, in your study guide, you have a chart called The God Who Is, correct? The ontological argument. And so I'd like to go through this real quickly. I know we don't have too much time left, but ontology is one of the 2 major branches of philosophy. Philosophy is just an enormous field of study, as I'm sure you know, but it can all be reduced down to 2 great fields. And one is the nature of reality. What is, what exists, what is real? And that's ontology, or sometimes referred to as metaphysics. And the other is, just as important as what is how can we know what is? How can we with confidence believe that we are in touch with reality? And that's called epistemology. Thank you. That's called epistemology. So we have ontology and epistemology, and those 2 fields encompass the whole realm of philosophy. And of course, you can go extremely deep into both of those areas. So I know you have this in front of you. I'll try for time's sake to be pretty quick about this, but I think it ties in very well with what we'll be talking about going forward. And that is, why should we believe in God, in a God, such as a God who's revealed in Scripture? And so this is the ontological argument. Now, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis refers to the sensation or the intimation of joy that he experienced through the magic of beauty when he saw his brother's little toy garden. In Christian apologetics, this relates the ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, years earlier, in that essay he wrote called The Weight of Glory, Lewis referred to this longing for God, basically, and for joy as trans-temporal. In other words, it takes us out of this temporary, mindset and all. And he calls it a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. And this is such a key thing, and I'll come back and punctuate that in just a couple of minutes here. A strong argument for God can be deduced based on humanity's longing for transcendence. Now, by the way, some of you who read, to some extent on philosophy and especially theological philosophy know that one of the greatest thinkers of the entire 1,000-year period, the medieval period, was Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas put forth what he called 5 proofs for the existence of God. And this is actually what we're talking about here is actually relates to one of those 5 proofs, but it's only one of 5. So anyway, a strong argument for God can be deduced based on humanity's longing for transcendence. Now, this is more of a, quote, spiritual or aesthetic argument, an argument based on the reality of beauty, than it is an intellectual one. Therefore, it resonates with some people and not with others. There are some people that read this and, it doesn't really, it's not that important. Other people read it and it really connects with their sensibilities and sensitivities, artistic, aesthetic sensibilities. Now, here's the point. Nothing in this world satisfies the deepest longings in our heart. Nothing. Nothing is ultimately fulfilling, whether it's intimate personal relationships or wealth or fame or power or success or status in life. It doesn't satisfy. Pleasure, sex, knowledge, wisdom, physical fitness, beauty, athletics, aesthetics, great art, literature, music, movies, and so on. I mean, some of it is just really inspiring and uplifting, but it still isn't satisfying. Think of a great movie you've seen in your life, one of the greatest you ever saw in your life. Well, how many times are you going to go back and watch that? Maybe every few years and all, but ultimately it really doesn't satisfy your deepest longings and needs and desires, is it? Why does nothing in this world suffice? Well, the reason is because ultimately we weren't made for this world. In Ecclesiastes, we read, God has set eternity in our hearts, a longing for, the ultimate stage of reality. So we are satisfied with nothing less than the source of eternity, and that's God himself. Augustine put it this way, "O Lord, we were made for you. Our hearts are restless till they rest in you." So again, nothing, no success or ambitions in life can suffice. Blaise Pascal put it this way, inside every person is a God-shaped vacuum that only God can fill. God-shaped vacuum. C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can really satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. Boy, isn't that a profound realization? Oh. Nothing in this life is an end in itself. Everything good points beyond itself to something transcendent. And here's a quote by Augustine, and I'll skip over that. I'd encourage you to read that, but we're nearly out of time. So let me skip on to the last two quotes here. One is from C.S. Lewis, who writes, quote, and again, consider how much he loved quality literature and books and so on. And he writes, the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust in them, trust only in them. It was not in them. It only came through them. And what came through them was longing, or, you know, a sense that there's something more beyond this realm of reality. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. And imagine, you know, the most beautiful music you've ever heard, or, you know, the music you just love to listen to. Well, it doesn't satisfy, does it? I mean, you may return to it time and time and time again, but obviously it's only hinting at something transcendent above and beyond itself. Even love hints at a transcendent reality. Many years ago, I read a book by Patrick Glenn called God, the Evidence, and he was he had been an atheist who came to faith in Christ and so on, and he wrote this book. And in that book, Patrick Glenn writes of his conversion from atheism to Christianity. And this is what he writes, quote, the first step, the rejection of nihilism. Now, what's that? What is nihilism? The idea, what, Pamela? Nothing is of value or meaning or anything. This life is really just a dirty trick, because we'd like to imagine that our lives have meaning and purpose, but they don't. And we're going to die and just rot in a, you know, in a hole in the ground. So that's basically nihilism. Patrick Glenn is saying the first step, the rejection of nihilism. In other words, he's beginning to think, well, maybe there is some meaning in life. I'm not just hoping and imagining that there's meaning in life, but there actually is. So the rejection of nihilism prepared me for the second, which was an encounter with love, love sufficiently deep to bring an intimation of the divine. It was shortly after my decision to reject nihilism that I encountered Gabrielle. Someone once said that it is hard to fall in love without thinking of God. Sure, that's real true, but anyway. Such was my experience. Ours was a wonderful romance that would culminate in marriage. But these romantic feelings pointed me towards something deeper. I read much later Martin Buber's notion that every true encounter with the, quote, thou points to the, quote, thou of God. Extended, the lines of relationship intersect in the eternal you. So I think, you know, as you kind of consider what we've said tonight and kind of meditate on some of these truths, they're just so deep, so profound. And the very idea that a young boy, you know, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, is beginning to have these kind of feelings, awareness, is really such a testimony to the greatness of God and the love of God. And I can't help but talk about this without contrasting his childhood with the childhood of, virtually every child who grows up today, who's just absolutely inundated and overwhelmed with distractions. You go into a restaurant and you see a mother and father and a child or two, and what's the child or two doing? They're playing games on their little cell phone and everything, which leaves absolutely no time for thinking or observing life in general and interacting. So are the parents. Yeah. And we're all very, very grateful for the beneficial aspects of, for instance, technology. And those of you joining us online, I mean, that's obvious to you all as well. And I'm very thankful that we have that. But it can just totally overwhelm ultimately why we're living, I guess you'd say. And we need quiet. And we need, think of a typical church service in an evangelical church like this. There's not a second of quiet, is there, in those worship services? It's just constant. One thing ends and another thing starts up and all. So we desperately need to develop an interior life in which we not only read and think about scripture, but meditate on scripture. I'm talking about, not Eastern meditation, obviously, but Christian meditation, thinking deeply about things. And you can't do that when you're surrounded with noise. And, we've often said for years, we go to lunch with good friends and all, and oftentimes, you try to carry on a meaningful conversation, but the restaurant's playing all this music, oftentimes just trash music. Sure, you've noticed, and very loud, and it's not intentionally a satanic deception they're trying to perpetrate, but it is. We need quiet, and we need to be able to think and relate to other people in a meaningful way without going into an environment where they think they have to entertain us constantly. I mean, if you're like us, if we go to a doctor's office, they think they have to have the television on. And usually they have it tuned to, what's your worst nightmare? If you were to, The View. Not real conducive to spiritual growth. And so that's the kind of world in which we live. And we need to be like C.S. Lewis in this regard, and that is intentionally countercultural. So I think as Christians, we need to encourage one another in that regard. So I think that's a good note to end on. So really good being with you all. And those of you joining us online, wonderful to see you as well. By the way, our study guide is available on Amazon. And so you can go on Amazon and order it and follow along with us. So very much looking forward to continuing next week. Blessings on the rest of your week, and certainly good being with you all. Thank you.